Hi. Today our topic is using interviews, part 1. This topic will be divided into 2 sessions. The first session we'll discuss it today, and the second in the next session. Objectives of today's sessions are: we are going to define an interview and explain its use as a research technique, discuss different concepts of the interview, explore different purposes of the interview, identify different types of interview, and compare merits of interviews and questionnaires, and discuss strengths and weaknesses of different types of interview, elaborate interview-based research procedures, and explain designing or scheduling of interview, and discuss question formats and response modes at the end. So let's begin with our first objective, that is to define and explain the purpose and use of interview. What is an interview? It is one of the most widely used and most fundamental research techniques. It enables researchers to obtain information that they cannot get by just observation or by questionnaires. An interview is an interchange of views between 2 or more people on a topic of mutual interest. In simple words, you can say that it is a conversation between a researcher and an informant. The term interview is related to the French word interview, E-N-T-R-E-V-U-E, which means to see one another or meet. And that is the basic meaning of face-to-face and meeting in any kind of interview. Though there are interviews in which no face-to-face meeting is required, for example, telephonic interview, but on a Skype, but the majority of interviews are still conducted in face-to-face meeting. An interview is a flexible tool for data collection, and it enables multi-sensory channels to be used, such as verbal, non-verbal, spoken, and heard. One of the features of any interview is that any interview is constructed. And when I say it is constructed, I mean that it is not conducted in a natural setting, as in the case of a conversation in an ordinary situation. So conversation is basically also a research technique, but that is mostly in the form of natural setting instead of constructing. And by constructing means that it is planned, it is in a way organized and predetermined what is going to be done in an interview. Well, let's move on to the next point in our objective, that is what are different concepts of the interview. What is the conceptions of the interview? But the researchers have identified many concepts. They have taken it into different senses. They can be summarized into three major concepts, and they are: number one, interview is a potential means of pure information transfer. Concept number one. Interview is a potential means of pure information transfer between the interlocutor or between the interlocutors, meaning the interviewer and interviewee. And this concept, this view of interview is closely related with the psychometrician's belief that there is a relatively permanent, consistent core to the personality about which a person will give information under certain conditions. So it is related to some way with the psychometrician's belief, and their methodology is that if the right answers are asked and the right procedure is followed and people are put under certain conditions, you can get the true personality of their life. This is the first concept of interview, that it is a potentially, it means pure information and how to dig out it from the interviewees. Second concept of interview is that it is a transaction. It is transactional, which inevitably has bias. If there is a transaction, there would be some biasness in it, or some prejudice in it, or some inclination in it, or some slant towards the subject matter would be involved. And if there is need, it should be recognized and controlled. According to this view, that interview is a transaction, each participant will define the situation in a particular way. No two people would explain it in the same phraseology and wouldn't have the same opinion or worldview about any object or about any phenomena in the world. The third concept of interview is that an interview is an encounter necessarily sharing many of the features of everyday life. So it is an encounter, and like any encounter in real life, it shares many of its features with everyday life. I'll give an example later on, but here I would like to add one more point, that interviewers and interviewee co-construct the world. It is not one-sided business, it is an encounter, and as in an encounter, both would be contributing towards the holistic overall meaning of the situation. In other words, they will be constructing the meaning through their interaction. So if we take the ordinary life, there are certain features identified by some of the researchers, especially Woods in 1986, that any successful encounter, there should be three important features. First, there should be a trust, there should be a curiosity, and there should be a naturalness. Trust, a relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee that transcended the research, that promotes a bond of friendship, that promoted a bond of friendship, a feeling of togetherness and joint pursuit of a common mission rising above personal egos or grudges. So for a successful interview, the trust should be built. The second point is the curiosity. There should be a desire to know, to learn people's views and perceptions of the facts, to hear their stories, discover their feelings. This is the motive force. And it has to be a burning force as well that should drive researchers to tackle and overcome the many difficulties involved in setting up and conducting successful interviews. So the first, like an ordinary encounter between two people, there should be a trust between them, and second, there should be a curiosity to know something. And the third should be naturalness. And by naturalness I mean that one endeavors to be unobtrusive in order to witness events as they are, untainted by one's presence and actions. So in interviews, the aim is to secure what is within the minds of interviewees, uncolored, unaffected by the interviewer. Means that there shouldn't be a way where it should be threatening, which keeps a distance between the interlocutors, a social distance, or some other kind of distance. It should be in a natural way, and it should be presented as an objective way as it possible, without coloring or affected by the interviewer. Well, there are certain factors which make one interview different from the other interview. The researchers have identified certain factors which I am going to discuss here. The point is how one interview is different from the other interview. So there are many factors which inevitably differ from one interview to another, such as they would be different in mutual trust, social distance, and the interviewer's control. Each interview would vary according to these measures, these variables. Like there won't be two interviews in which the trust is of the same level, or there is no social distance between the interviewer and the interviewee, or there will be equal control of the interviewer. So that is factor number one, which differentiates interviews between one interview and the other interviews. The second point is that the respondent may well feel uneasy and adopt avoidance tactics if the questioning is too deep, hard, or grilling. So every interview is unique or different and depends how the respondent feel about it. And if they feel uneasy, they try to avoid answering or giving the information. Then in any interview, both interviewer and interviewee are bound to hold back part of what it is in their power to state. So withholding information, not giving the full information, is another factor which differentiates one interview from the other. Point number 4 is many of the meanings that are clear to one will be relatively opaque to the other, even when the intention is genuine communication. So the meanings because the meaning is not fixed, and one word or phrase would mean different things to different people. For some it would be clear, for others it would be hard or opaque. So it is impossible, point number 5, it is impossible, as in everyday life it is impossible, to bring every aspect of the encounter within rational control. So anything can go wrong or the other way round. So these are the factors which are important, and these are the factors which are responsible for differentiating between one interview and the other interview. Okay, now we move on to discuss different purposes of the interview. So what are the situations or conditions for which interviews are conducted? Or in simple words, why do we need interviews? The purposes or the functions of the interview are variant, and there are many. For example, I have identified a few for you here. Number 1 purpose of interview is to evaluate or assess a person in some respect. So assessment and evaluation is one of the purpose of an interview. You interview someone to assess the abilities and skills of a person. The second purpose of interview is to select or promote an employee. So you have in selection boards, in the job, in employment, usually interviews are conducted to get the better candidate. The third purpose of interview is a kind of therapeutic change or effect, as it is done in a psychiatric interview where the patient is given time and space to talk, and the psychiatrist understands and evaluates from the responses of the respondent. The fourth purpose of interview is to test or develop hypotheses, and that is related with the educational research, and which will be the major focus of our study. And to gather data. Number 5, to gather data as in surveys or in experimental situations, and that is another field of academic research. So the primary fundamental purpose of interview in academic research is to gather data, okay, and especially through the surveys or the experimental design or situations. And lastly, the purpose of interview is to sample respondents' views. Sometimes people want to know what are the opinion of the people about some product or about some policy of the government, and usually the interviews at the doorsteps are conducted in this way. Now let's look at the types of interviews, where the literature on interviews and research methodology books and research students guidebooks have identified many types of interviews. Some of them can be presented in this way. There are certain interviews which you can say that they are standardized interviews. So number 1 is standardized interview. Number 2, in-depth interviews. Number 3, ethnographic interviews. Number 4, elite interviews. And number 5, life history interviews. Number 6, focus groups interviews. And number 7, semi-structured interviews. And number 8, group interviews. And number 9, structured interviews. And number 10, informal conversational interviews. Number 11, interview guide approaches. And number 12, standardized open-ended interviews. Well, as the list is very long, it indicates that there is no one type of interview, and their type is determined according to the type of research questions. Type of research question would determine the type of interview. In some cases, you would see that there are many things which are common between an interview and a questionnaire. So if you compare the merits of interviews versus questionnaire, you can look that one in this table. Well, first of all, on the right-hand column, we'll see what is the consideration and what do they say, what the interview is related with that one and the questionnaire is related with that one. Personal need to collect data. There is a personal need to collect data. So which method of data collection will you use? Will it be interview or it will be a questionnaire? So personal need to collect data would include a more appropriate, it requires interviews. And personal need to collect data requires, in the form of questionnaire, you require a secretary. What are the major expenses in the form of interview and a questionnaire? So for major expense, payment to the interviews in some advanced type of interviews are situations where you have to pay the interviewees, you have to pay them some money. And if you are using this technique, you think about this, about paying some money. In some cases, as in England, for the survey type of questions, they usually give you, say, £5 to 10 or 15 pounds for answering or filling up, for conducting an interview. Money is also involved if you collect data through the questionnaire and if you are using a postal type of questionnaire where you have to spend some money on its postage and in its printing. If you are using a postal interview, postal questionnaire, then you have to pay the postage for that one. Then what are the opportunities for response keying or personalization? There is a lot, it is extensive for interview. There are personal contact, interpersonal relations, interaction with the interviewee or respondents. And whereas what is the feature of a questionnaire, there is a limited interaction or no interaction between the researcher and the respondent. Then opportunities to ask questions. There are extensive opportunities for the researcher to ask question in an interview, whereas in the form of a questionnaire there is a limited scope or no scope at all for asking a question, rephrasing it, or clarify it. Then what are the opportunities for probing, to dig deep, to ask for exploration or elaborations in the form of an interview? It is quite possible. In the form of questionnaire, it would be difficult. Then what's the relative magnitude of data reduction? That is great in the form of interviews because of its coding, whereas in the form of questionnaires, they are mainly limited to raw string. Typically, the number of respondents who can be reached, where there are limited number of people you can interview, whereas in the case of a questionnaire, it is extensive and large. Rate of return in the form of questionnaire, it is very poor. Not all people would respond and turn the questionnaires back, whereas in interview, there is a good chance that you got hold of someone and you interview it. What could be the possible sources of error in an interview and a questionnaire? Well, sources of error in the form of interview could be the interviewer, the instrument you are using for recording the interview, the coding of the data, and maybe the sample of the population you are interviewing. Whereas in questionnaire, these errors would be limited only to instrument and sample. Instrument would be maybe some fault in your questionnaire, and sampling, whether the sample is true representative of the population or not. What is the overall reliability of these two methods of data collection? In interview, it is quite limited, whereas in questionnaire, the reliability is fair, because people have a time to think and give maybe honest opinion, whereas in interview, in a face-to-face interview, there might be some chances, there might be a chance, a fear that people won't give the honest opinion. Though it also applies to questionnaire, but because of the distance between the respondent and the questioner or the researcher, there is probability that it would be less. So emphasis on writing skill. Well, there is some writing involved in case of questionnaire. People have to write in, so they need to be literate to answer the question on a questionnaire. Writing is involved, whereas in interview, there is no writing involved. So these are certain features, and they differentiate these two methods of data collection. And when you design your research, you need to keep these points and compare which method of data collection would be most suitable in your conditions for your research. If you have to take some data, just one example, from the people who are illiterate, old people, never have been to school, don't know the writing skills. So anybody who suggests a questionnaire for them would be problematic. In that case, there could be other ways to get or collect data, and one of them would be the interview. You need to interview them. So there are certain strengths and weaknesses of different types of interviews. Well, the previous slide was there about the comparison between the interview and a questionnaire, and each has its own merits. The point was to look at the good points, the merits of each and then decide which one is most appropriate for your research question or your research design. Now let's move on different types of interview and what are their strengths and weaknesses. We discussed different types of interviews. If you go back, types of interview, a list of 12 I've just counted, and how they are different and what are the strengths and weaknesses of each. So I made here 4 columns. In the first column you have a type of interview, and the second column tells you about the characteristics of that interview type, and column number 3 tells you about what are the strengths of that type of interview, and the fourth column tells you what are the weaknesses associated with that type of interview. So if the type of interview is informal, conversational interview, what are its features or characteristics? If it is informal and it is conversational, the questions emerge from the immediate context and are asked in the natural course of things. There is no predetermination of question topics or wording. So that is the feature of a conversational interview, informal conversational interview, that you don't have a pre-planned topics or predetermined questions or words. They would develop with the due course of conversation. What are its strengths? Well, it increases the salience and relevance of questions. Interviews are built on and emerge from the observations. The interview can be matched to individuals and circumstances. So it emerges during the conversation, and more realistic and more appropriate to ask a question because it is question answer, and there is a possibility to probe and ask the right questions. What are its weaknesses? The weakness of this type of interview, that is informal conversational interview, is that the different information collected from different people with different questions, because in every situation would be different and different questions would be asked to different people. So it will be less systematic and less comprehensive if certain questions don't arise naturally. And data organization and the analysis can be difficult. At the analysis stage, there will be a problem. Even at the coding stage, there will be a problem because there will be different questions and there will be different opinions of the people. Hard to analyze. Second type of interview is interview guide approach. So what are its features? What are its salient characteristics? Well, the topics and issues to be covered are specified in advance in an outline form. So interviewer decides sequence and working of questions in the course of the interview. So in this type of interview, that is the interview guide approach, the topics and issues are predetermined. However, they are sequenced by the interviewer as the interview goes on. What are its strengths? Well, its strengths are the outline increases the comprehensiveness of data and makes data collections somewhat systematic for each respondent. So logical gaps in data can be anticipated and closed, and interviews remain fairly conversational and situational. So these are the good points of the one. If anything is, it is predetermined what topics would be asked, though there are not the definite questions, or the questions are not finalized, but the topics are finalized in advance. So there is an opportunity whether all the topics have been exhaustively covered, and if any gap is left, that is filled up. What are the weaknesses of this type of interview? Important and salient topics may be inadvertently omitted. So interview flexibility in sequencing and wording questions can result in substantially different responses, thus reducing the comparability of responses. As there are no predetermined words or questions designed, it may lead to the exact questioning and the wording of the question different, and that might be difficult for comparison later on. Third type of interview is a standardized open-ended interview. Standardized open-ended interviews. What are their characteristics or features? In these types of interviews, the exact wording and sequence of questions are determined in advance. All interviewees are asked the same topic questions in the same order, in the same words or phraseology. What are its strengths, this type of interview? Well, respondents answer the same questions, thus increasing comparability of responses. Data are complete for each person on the topics addressed in the interview. It reduces interview effects and bias when several interviews are used, and it permits decision makers to see and review the instrumentation used in evaluation. So it facilitates organization and analysis of the data. So it's easy to analyze. What are its drawbacks? What are the drawbacks of standardized open-ended interviews? Well, there is little flexibility in relating the interview to particular individuals and circumstances. So standardized wording or phrases of questions may constrain and limit naturalness and relevance of questions and answers. That is the drawback of the standardized open-ended interviews. The fourth type of interview is a closed quantitative interview. In closed quantitative interviews, what we do? What are their features or characteristics? Well, in closed quantitative interviews, questions and response categories are determined in advance, like standardized open-ended interviews. Responses are fixed. Respondent chooses from among these fixed responses. So it is more like a questionnaire, where you have a question and you also provide them some options, and the respondents have to choose one of them. What are the strengths or good points about this type of interview? Well, in this case, the data collected, the data analysis is simple. Responses can be directly compared and easily sum up. Many short questions can be asked in a short time, just like a questionnaire. What are its weaknesses? Well, its weaknesses are that respondents must fit their experiences and their feelings into the researcher's already determined categories. That may be perceived as impersonal, irrelevant, and a kind of mechanistic, because there is no interpersonal, there is no freedom to the interview to present his views freely. This can distort what respondents really mean or experience, so completely limiting their response to the choices given. That is some of the interviews, 4 types of interviews, and their strengths, their characteristics, their strengths and weaknesses just covered. Well, we discussed different paradigms, and within that we discussed quantitative and qualitative approaches. Here, the data generated from questionnaires can also be related to one of those paradigms, whether that would be quantitative or qualitative. What I mean, that a questionnaire is just a tool. It depends what type. An interview is a data collection tool, like a questionnaire. And the type of questions you ask in an interview would determine what type of data you have collected, or what type of data you need. Do you need a quantitative type of data, or you need a qualitative type of data? And here is a comparison. What differentiates a qualitative approach and a quantitative approach? The quantitative approaches emphasize numbers, qualitative approaches words. There is predetermined, and they are given in quantitative. In qualitative, they are open-ended and they are responsive. Quantitative approaches measurability is the key word, and qualitative is capturing the uniqueness. Means quantitative measures and counts how many interested in it, whereas in qualitative the importance is given to the unique phenomena or unique qualities of an individual and capturing those uniqueness. Quantitative approaches are short-term, are intermittent. Qualitative approaches are long-term and continuous. Quantitative approaches are comparing, whereas qualitative approaches are capturing particularity. What is particular, specific about this individual? Quantitative approaches are correlating. Qualitative approaches are valuing quality. Quantitative approaches are about the frequencies. Qualitative approaches are about the individuality. Quantitative approaches are formal, they are about the formality. Qualitative is informality. Quantitative, looking at, whereas qualitative, looking for. And quantitative for the regularities, finding the patterns and regularities. Qualitative, looking for uniqueness. Quantitative is description. Qualitative is explanation. Quantitative, objective facts. Qualitative, subjective facts, subjectivity. Quantitative, describing. Qualitative, interpreting. Quantitative, looking in from the outside, detachment, and looking the appearance, what is over there. In qualitative, it is looking from the inside, what goes inside the head of the individuals. Quantitative is structured, qualitative approach is unstructured, and quantitative is statistical, whereas qualitative approach is ethnographic. So it depends what type of data you need and you want to emphasize, and you have to take them as paradigms and classify or categorize your data accordingly. What is your research question and what type of data and evidence you need to claim your argument. That depends on the research question, and that determines what type of data and what type of approach you need. Let me make clear here that interview as well as the questionnaire are just data collecting tools. The wording of questions in a questionnaire and interview determines whether you are collecting a qualitative type or a quantitative type of data. And these are certain parameters which I have just mentioned. So keeping in view what type of interviews are there, researchers have identified or put different interviews into 4 categories. So what are those 4 categories of interview? Well, there are the structured interview, there is an unstructured interview, there is the non-directive interview, and a focused interview. So 4 main kinds of interviews have been reported in literature on interviews. So what is the structured interview? Well, the structured interview is the interview in which the content and procedures are organized in advance. What would be the procedure followed? What would be the content or subject matter? What would be the questions? And in what ways it would be asked? That is already determined before the interview starts. So that type of interview is called the structured interview. The second type of interview is the unstructured interview. An unstructured interview is one in which there is an open situation and it has a greater flexibility and freedom. The questions are not predetermined. The interviewer makes questions by looking at by having an interaction with the interviewee, and the questions are generated and their language is also made up during the interview. The third type of or the third kind of interview is the non-directive interview. So non-directive interview is a research technique that derives from the therapeutic psychiatric interview, as I mentioned above. The principal features of this interview, that is non-directive interview, is the principal features of it are the minimal direction or control shown by the interviewer and the freedom the respondent has to express his or her subjective feelings as fully and as spontaneously as he or she chooses or is able. So no direction, no lead is given. Respondent is given free and open space and time to say whatever one wishes. That is called the non-directive interview, and it is a kind of interview which usually psychiatrists use with their patients. The fourth type of interview is called the focused interview. It is a focused interview. As the name indicates, it focuses on a respondent's subjective responses to a known situation in which he or she has been involved and which has been analyzed by the interviewer prior to the interview. What I mean that it is a focus interview. Interviewer knows what he or she is going to ask and already got information or done some research on the topic, and even the interviewee knows the situation. Because that would be based on the personal experience or involvement of the interviewee in a particular situation. Next stage is planning interview-based research procedures. Well, there are different stages, as we discussed in the previous lecture about the planning of a questionnaire and different stages of the designing and administering of a questionnaire. In the same way, researchers have identified and suggested stages of an interview investigation, and in this part we'll look at thematizing number 1, designing interview number 2, interviewing number 3, transcribing number 4, analyzing number 5, verifying number 6, and reporting number 7. 7 aspects of planning interview. We'll restrict today only to thematizing and designing, and rest of the points, I mean the 5 different aspects of interviewing, transcribing, analyzing, verifying, and reporting will be discussed in the next lecture. Well, what do we mean thematizing? And that should be the beginning and the first thing while planning an interview. That is the preliminary stage of an interview study, and it will point what is the purpose of the research and where the purpose of the research is decided. And it may begin, thematizing may begin by outlining the theoretical basis of the study. So, what are the theoretical framework or the basis of your study will determine the type of interview you need. That's why it's a thematizing, so it comes out of the theory. So what you need to look at on the thematizing aspect of it, what are its broad aims? What are the aims of the research? What is the practical value of it if you apply it in your research as a research tool. And the reasons why the interview approach was chosen. Why not the alternative approaches, maybe questionnaire, observation, case study. There may then follow the translation of the general goals of the research into more detailed and specific objectives. So this is the most important step, means the thematizing, and it is the first step deciding about the interview. For only careful formulation of objectives at this point will eventually produce the right kind of data, the data necessary for satisfactory answers to your research problem. Thus, in your planning, the second stage after your deciding on your aims and objectives of the research is actually designing the interview. And by designing means what? The designing involves translating the research objectives into the questions that will make up the main body of the interview, and I'll use the word schedule here. And what are those in the schedule? Well, you need to decide about the objectives of the interview. What are the aims and objectives of the interview? Decide about the nature of the subject matter, whether the interview is dealing in facts, opinions, or attitudes, whether specificity or depth is sought, the respondent's level of education, educated, uneducated, highly educated, the kind of information the respondent can expect it to have. Are you asking or interviewing the person who knows it, or he won't have that information? So you have to design your interview and its questions according to the level of information they can provide. Whether or not the respondent's thoughts need to be structured, some assessment of his or her motivational level, what would be their emotional level or attachment with the topic. It is interesting for you, but that would be interesting for the respondents. The extent of the interviewer's own insight into the respondent's situation, and the kind of relationship the interviewer can expect to develop with respondent. All these points you need before you design the final interview. Okay, there are three kinds of items or points which are used in the construction of design or schedules used in academic research interviews. The first one is the fixed alternative items, which allow the respondent to choose from two or more alternatives. The most frequently used is the dichotomous item, which offers two alternatives only, yes or no, agree or disagree, for instance. Sometimes a third alternative, such as undecided or don't know, is also offered. So a type of question would be like this, where is a fixed alternative items are provided. Do you feel it is against the interests of a school to have make public its examination results? And the choices are given yes, no, don't know. The three choices. Second type of construct is open-ended items. So these items supply a frame of reference for respondents' answers, but put a minimum of restraint on the answers and their expressions. So example of this type, the open-ended items would be, what kind of television programs do you most prefer to watch? So as compared to the fixed alternative, there is a choice because it begins with what kind of television program, so they can choose any they like. So that is the second type of construct. The third type of construct is a kind of a scale. A scale is a set of verbal items to each of which the interviewee responds by indicating degrees of agreement or disagreement. So the response of the individual is located on a scale of fixed alternatives. The use of this technique along with open-ended question is a comparatively recent addition or development, and means that scale scores can be checked against data elicited by the open-ended questions. Example of this scale type is such as attendance at school after the age of 14 should be voluntary, and you strongly agree, undecided, disagree, strongly disagree. On a scale they give their opinion. So it's possible to choose one of a number of scales in this context. We can use attitude scales, rank order scales, rating scales, which we discuss with reference to the questionnaires in our previous lecture. As we discussed, there are different formats in preparing questionnaires, so there are different question formats for the interview as well. And there are several ways of categorizing these questions. They can be most frequently used questions could be categorized or classified into descriptive type of questions, or experience questions, or behavior questions, or knowledge questions, or construct forming questions, or contrast questions, where asking respondents to contrast one thing with another, or feeling questions, sensory questions, background questions, demographic questions. So while making or designing an interview, you also need to make and design questionnaires. And there should be a variety of questionnaires keeping in view this list. And the specific information you need, the type that will dictate the type of question you require, whether you need a descriptive type of question to get that information, or experience type of questions, and so on and so forth. The last type of question is the process question, that is, questions that introduce a topic or interview, follow up on a topic or idea, probe for further information, or response. Ask respondents to specify and provide examples directly, or ask for information indirectly, or ask for information, interpret respondents' replies. So in the list you add the question formats, there is a process type of question. That was about the design or the construct of questions, or what type of questions could be included in the questionnaire. At this stage, remember that we are discussing the planning stage of an interview. You should also think about what would be the response modes you would ask your interviewees to give the response. There are different construct of formats for the questions. There are certain modes in which the questions can be recorded or presented. So if there are varied ways of asking questions, it follows there will be several ways in which they may be answered. It is to the different response modes that we turn now. The first of these is the unstructured response. This allows respondents to give their answer in whatever way they choose. Say, the question is, why do you not go to university? So that is an unstructured, and in the sense that the respondent can answer this question any way he or she wishes. A structured response, by contrast, would limit the respondents in some way. And here the example can be, can you give me 2 reasons for not going to university? So if you phrase the question like this, you actually bound the respondents that they choose only or answer within a frame in a controlled manner, in a structured way. Then there is another mode of a response, and it is called a fill-in response mode, and it requires the respondent to supply rather than choose a response, though the response is often limited to a word or a phrase. The example of this type of response could be, what is your present occupation? Or, how long have you lived at your present address? So they have to fill in the information. That's why it is called fill-in response mode. Then there is a tabular response, and it is in the form of a table. The response is similar to a fill-in response, though it is more structured, and it may demand maybe a word or maybe a figure or a phrase. Then we have a scale response, a mode of response that is called scale, in which it is one type of response which is structured by means of a series of gradations, and respondents are required to record their response to a given statement by selecting from a number of alternatives. Then there is another mode that is called a ranking response, and it is one in which a respondent is required to rank order a series of words, phrases or statements according to a particular criterion. Example of a ranking response could be, rank order the following people in terms of their usefulness to you as sources of advice and guidance on problems you have encountered in the class. Use number 1 to 5, with 1 representing the person most useful. You have 5 options. You have given them 1 to 5 numbers, and 1 stands for the most useful, the 5 less useful or the least useful. And you give them the options like education tutor, subject tutor, class teacher, head teacher, other student, which one you think is the most useful, and then categorize them according to their importance or usefulness. Another mode of recording the response is a checklist response, and it requires the respondents select one of the alternatives presented to them. In that way, they do not represent points on a continuum on a line, and they are nominal categories. So example of a checklist response would be, I get more satisfaction in college from, and then you give them all choices: the social life, studying on my own, attending lectures, college societies giving a paper at a seminar. So most satisfaction, they have to take check 1. Well, we have reached towards the end of this session, and in this session we started with the interview, and our objectives were to define and explain what is an interview and how to use it as a research technique, discuss different concepts of interview, and explore different purposes of the interview, then identify different types of interview, compare different merits of interviews and questionnaires, discuss strengths and weaknesses of different types of interviews, and elaborate interview-based research procedures, and design a schedule interview and different question formats and answer or a response modes discussed. So that is the end of this session, and we'll continue with the second part of using interviews as research tools for collecting data, and that would be based on interviewing and other aspects of using interviews. So thank you very much for listening. That is the end of the session.